Hi guys, such Mobim here again. The Land Use Act of 1978 is one of the most controversial land, laws in Nigeria, and also I could say one of the most important land laws in Nigeria. Now, this particular law grants the state governor of any state in Nigeria an almost absolute right to control, manage, and administer who owns what and for what purpose you are owning the land in that particular state. Did you know that this particular law, regardless the fact that some reservations were actually made for federal government, owned lands, it still grants that right of ownership and administration of land in that particular state on the state governor. That is to say, the state governor has rights, quote unquote, over even the land where you have the federal government properties. We can also see that regardless this landlord title, this small god title, or privilege or rules that was given to state governors, it takes more than the law for a state governor to really, wield this power over the years across the 32 states of Nigeria plus Abuja inclusive. Now, in today's video, we are going to spend some time, bringing out, some few examples to buttress our point that the law, the provisions of the law notwithstanding, it takes capacity, political will of the state governor of any particular state in Nigeria to actually wield this power, to use these rights and privileges for a set purpose. We are going to be talking about a few examples. Number one on the list is the state government versus the federal government on the Ruga policy. Now, if you are a Nigerian and you've been active on the news, trace it back to 2019, a little bit prior to 2019 and down, during the administration of General Muhammad Buhari, you will understand this particular example I'm actually giving. When the federal government wanted to introduce a Ruga settlement for cattle rearers and their cattle, across the 32 states of Nigeria. Now, the idea is this: the federal government wanted to acquire, lands for cattle rearers across the 36 states of Nigeria. What it then means is this: that they will acquire this property and then give it to cattle rearers, for the purpose of settlement, where they will have to, build all their ranches and then develop. It's more like a small community, that has its own power, water supply, electricity, everything. You understand? And the good idea, the policy and everything will be sitting on a land. That is to say, they actually need a land to get that thing into fruition. Now, where did the issue or problem start? You now notice that initially it was almost a good idea until people started seeing beyond the obvious, because the investments will be sitting on the land, and land is something very controversial. Land is spiritual. Land is a sacred thing, to almost everybody, especially here in Africa. The state governments, especially the southern part of Nigeria, all came in unison, plus Imo State, to reject that particular policy and idea. Now, even the Benue State governor at some point sued the federal government on this particular case and won. So that is to say, in recent times, in recent history, that is one of the most significant examples where the state governor has actually wielded his power as given, in the 1978, Act, Land Use Act, has wielded that power, that right, that privilege of being the landlord of the state. So regardless the apex government, regardless the interest of the federal government, if you check the trajectory of the federal government as regards the Ruga policy, you understand that they do, have a comprehensive, idea about the Land Use Act decree, Land Use Act, and the kind of power the state governor wields. They did not outrightly, command, the state governments to give this particular law for free. No, they actually come in as investors, seeking investment in that particular state. So what the Ruga policy wanted to do was, to through the federal government acquire those lands and then give it out to who they wanted to give it out to. The sentiments apart, but the idea here is that the federal government tried acquiring properties in different states, and the state governors sat on it, rejected that particular move, and it stood up to this day. That is just to give you one example of the state governments, in Nigeria wielding their power. I tell you, the Land Use Act of 1978 that law is controversial. Whoever were involved, in setting up that particular law saw beyond the ordinary. I know that this particular law has its own issues, but at this very moment, it's still standing. Now, number 2 on our list is the case between the Imo State government, as it were, and the host communities of Imo Airport. Now, if you trace back, history, there's a wonderful story about, how the first civilian, governor of Imo State, the old Imo State that comprises of Imo, present-day Imo, Abia, and the southern part of Ebonyi, how he galvanized the community to start up one of the first, or the first ever community-sponsored airport as a project. So it's a beautiful story. But it did not just happen that way. One part of the story where people, have forgotten or just intentionally choose to leave out is the fact that the host community, some of the host communities did not see this as a funny gesture. Like I said earlier, there are so many attachments to land. Land is life. Land is sacred. Land is beyond the physical. There are so many things attached to it, pride, and every other thing. So the host communities, in this particular case now, initially resisted the idea, of setting up that airport. Not like they don't want the airport, but the fact that it will be their land that will be used for this particular purpose. So the families involved, of course, there were issues, the community heads and all, they will be settled, and then they will have, an MOU with the government, but then the direct people, but now people with the direct impact will not be in the same shoes, with the leaders of the community. Now you notice that there were heavy resistance amongst the families that own, parts of the land. At some point, it took the presence of the military, to get the project, started off, and up to an extent before, over time, the military people came in and all. So the construction, from the start to finish, lasted like, say, a decade. Between 1983 when it started to about 1994 when it was fully, constructed and commissioned by a military governor. Now you notice that the story has changed over time, but it's met with heavy resistance. Now the idea is this. It also took the political will, capacity, and sagacity of the governor, or the governors in question, before this particular project got started. It was sustained, and up to this day, it's still standing. You understand that regardless the provisions of the 1978 Land Use Act, it took the political will, strength, and minds of the governors at the time to execute this project to the letter, to actually acquire that land from the host communities of Imo Airport and execute the project to the letter. The same thing happens generally where a government is trying to construct roads, and then you see someone's property falling in line to the place where the engineers have actually mapped out. They will always want to make troubles, they will always want to make issues, but it will take the provisions of the law are there. But it takes, a government with the will and capacity to actually, execute the provisions of the law to the letter. Now, this is not to glorify, thuggery and the use of force and every other thing. No, but I'm just saying that regardless what the provisions of the law states, nobody is going to welcome, any particular law that's working directly or indirectly against him You understand? So it will only take the use of force, in a way, in quotes, the use of force to put some things in place, especially with regards to land ownership. It is done almost everywhere. Now, another example we are going to give, and it's going to be the last for this particular episode, is the case between the Imo State government, Federal University of Technology Owerri, and their host communities. Now, you understand this. Still, so many years ago, before the creation of FUTO, I think around 1970, 1981, 1983, when FUTO was created, a large portion of land was actually acquired by the then, state government for the purpose of establishing a Federal University of Technology in Imo State, and that was done, almost welcomed, the size of land. But what happened is this: when FUTO moved to their present site, and over time has actually occupied this particular site, it was discovered actually that regardless the size that was given to FUTO, they've not been able to really occupy everything. The land is so huge and so much that what happened was that the host communities, because they've grown over years, they went through a particular route to demand back some portions of the land that were initially acquired, from them. We've said this in our previous episodes, talking about accession. That process is called accession, whereby a host communities apply to the government to give them back some chunk of the land that was acquired from them for the purposes of, one, for expansion purposes, when their people want to settle. That is to say, the place they actually stay in at the moment has actually been, overly, populated, and there's need for expansion. The government will pay heed to you. Two, because of increasing population and all, people are heavily dependent on land for farming purposes and all those things. That is another condition for government to actually look at your case when it comes to accession. And the truth is, as regards the particular case, over the years, a few places have actually been excised, given back to the people, the host communities of FUTO. You understand? Now, what happened is this: there are different sections. Like I said, a number of communities. The communities, they are more than 30. You have Ihiagwa, you have Nekede, you have Ubinze, Umuchima, Ezibudo, and people in the environment. You understand? So over time, this community will apply, they will give them. This community will apply, they will give them. And almost every community is applying at different times for different purposes. Now, what happens is this: you see, when they apply for this, for this accession, some of the dubious ones will now go behind the governments and their leaders to start selling out portions of this land that actually in the process of getting excised. Now, being in the process of getting excised does not equate being excised, because at the end of the day, governments do reject accession applications. You understand? Now, what happened is this: in this particular case of FUTO land, is some dubious ones, went behind to sell portions of this land with the title accession in process, sold it to real estate people, sold it to individuals, and all. For over time, people started living, developing this particular, portions of land and all. Now, the state government came up one day, in conjunction with FUTO and all, with the idea of actually expanding the school, and then they now choose this particular area that is accession in process, one of the areas actually that is accession in process, to set and develop the medical and health, faculty of the school, that is FUTO. You understand? Now, upon the realization of this, the real estate value of that particular place drops immediately, because this is actually a place that's almost bustling. You will see it's actually the next happening place. Real estate companies had loops and chunks of acres of land around that particular area, and they were fast selling, doing their adverts on TV, on social media, on the radio stations and all, and proudly so. Then boom, the news came in, and the government went in and demolished every single building, guys. Now, it is very, very important before you acquire that property. I know we've digressed a little bit now, but I needed to say this. Before you acquire any property, do well to do your due diligence. Everybody's talking about due diligence. Your due diligence is to get a professional surveyor to chart that land. Your due diligence is to get a good real estate lawyer, get a good real estate company, a trusted, vet every person you are working with, whether it's the surveyor, the agent, the lawyer. Vet everybody. And there are ways to do that. Check up on our video archive. You feed yourself with the required necessary information that will be needed. So what I'm saying here is this. Here is another case where the state government, showed capacity, showed will. You understand? It is true that the host communities applied for a cession, but the cession was still in process, and they went behind the government and started selling that particular land. You understand? Soft-pedaled. You understand the situation. You notice that tomorrow that kind of a gesture will rise up again. Somebody will just come up and say, okay, fine, in reference to this particular, because the state government did not do anything here. It also implies that he's likely not going to do anything in this particular case, and before you know it, it becomes a common thing or a common practice. Government claims the land, and then an individual come to show will on that particular thing. Now, since the promulgation of the 1978 Land Use Act, it has always been known, and that is the essence of this video, that there's always the use of force, to enforce the provisions of the Land Use Act, especially as regards the governor's right to administer, manage and control, land ownership in the state. Now, the three examples I mentioned are actually, open knowledge. I made mention of the Ruga case, the federal government by state government. I made mention of the case between the Imo State government as a then versus the host communities of Imo State Airport. We also have the Imo State government versus the Futo versus the host communities, where they had to sell, host communities going behind the federal government to sell, land in a cession process, and then the state government came back and then, impounded on those, properties and took back their rights, took back, the land, from the people who we are dubiously, sold the lands to. Now, this is just to bring to our knowledge that regardless the provisions of the Land Use Act of 1978, which wields so much power to, almost an absolute power to a state governor, it does not come like that. So it also takes the use of force, political will, and strategy to really, acquire land from the people, from the local people, and anybody who owns that land. You understand? So it's not just okay because the law stated it and that is how it's going to be. There's always fight. There's always use of force. For the government to really implement some of the provisions of the law. Thank you guys. By this video, I hope I've been able to enlighten you and not to confuse you about the rights of the governor of a particular state, to administer almost absolute rights over who owns what and who gets what when it comes to land in that particular state. Guys, like, share, subscribe to the channel. By liking, you're actually helping the YouTube algorithm. It will help more people who need videos like this to see them. So please subscribe, like, hit on the notification bell, and then be sure to get our notifications when we pop up videos every week. Thank you guys, and God bless you. See you next time.